As we begin our program on hardwiring teamwork, we're really focusing our attention now on how to create and sustain collaborative organizations. It's interesting, Peter and I, over 30 years ago, first published our organizational culture survey. And in the 30 years since then, it has been used all over the world for people and researchers who are trying to measure organizational culture. I bring that up now because in all the administrations of the organizational culture survey, the lowest consistent category is the one about engagement, participation, and involvement. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the questions in that. Questions that deal with, are your ideas valued? To what extent do people connect with you before they make decisions about your work? Is your knowledge and experience in the organization counted? Do people respect it? Those sorts of questions. So we have known for quite some time that creating engaged, collaborative organizations is tough, even if your heart is in it. And so we began looking at this and researching it, and I want you to know that after 4 decades of looking at this topic, we have come to the conclusion that when collaboration is present, results can be miraculous. When collaboration is absent, results can be dire. And I'd like to give you an example of each of those so you know what we mean.
So could I suggest you start with the dire and leave us on a good note?
Sure, we'll start with the dire first.
Thank you.
Okay, the dire. So, how many of you remember the Challenger disaster? It was the first time that the US sent a rocket ship up with a civilian, Teacher of the Year, Christine McCullough, upon takeoff, fiery ball, and unfortunately all the school children were also watching. So it was a huge disaster moment in our history. Raise your hand if you remember that. Okay. I'm going to ask you another question. I want you to raise your hand if you remember it, but I don't want you to tell me the answer. Raise your hand if you remember the cause of the Challenger disaster. Hands up if you remember the cause. Okay, a nice hearty group. I'm going to count to 3, and together would you please say the cause? 1, 2, 3.
Miscommunication.
Okay. O-rings, right.
Somebody read our book.
Somebody read our book, though. So, interesting. The O-rings, for years, were deemed to be the cause of the Challenger disaster. But the truth is, it had to do with organizational culture. It had to do with the fact that there were engineers throughout NASA who had deep, deep concerns that those O-rings had never been tested for the temperature extremes they were about to endure. However, the culture at NASA was so hierarchical that the voices of those engineers were not heard. The launch happened, and the results were a disaster. Now, that is not the soft stuff. You know, people sometimes think, oh, collaboration, involvement, participation, engagement, that's the soft stuff. The Challenger disaster was not the soft stuff. That was life and death decision making. So I told you I'd have another positive one as well. So here's a more positive example. Remember, because we said that when collaboration is present, results can be miraculous. So how many of you remember the SARS epidemic? Okay, so a hearty amount.
This is the good one, right?
Yeah, this is getting better. Yes, this is getting better. So the SARS epidemic, when it happened, was really scarier than Ebola. I mean, it was like the scariest thing because the world was just not prepared for it. The World Health Organization said, we are approaching this in a completely different way. We will approach this collaboratively. And you know how they did that? They reached out to research places all over the world, labs across the world, and they said, if you want to be in our consortium, here's what you need to agree to. You need to agree to having a fully collaborative relationship with the other research labs in the consortium, and that means every 24 hours, we will have a phone call. And in that phone conference, everyone will share everything they learned, and we will do that until we identify this virus and create a treatment. Do you know how long it took them to do that? 3 weeks. And when those researchers were interviewed, many of them agreed it could have been more like 3 years if it hadn't been collaborative.
So we were in New Zealand a couple of months ago working with a research company, and this woman, Susan just told that story, and this woman leaped out of her chair and she said, "I was in one of those research labs." And I said, "No kidding." I said, "Well, did Susan tell the story accurately?" And she said, "Spot on." She said, "We were blown away when we came up with an approach, a serum that actually dealt with this disease." So, I mean, it was really fun to meet a real person who was in it.
Isn't that? So I think the point at the very beginning of our time in this program is this. Collaboration, hardwiring teamwork, participation, involvement, engagement, those are not just touchy-feely terms. Well, if we had time, it would be nice, but we don't have time.